Red Dead Redemption 2 on PC, finally it's out. Potentially the ultimate incarnation of one of the most technically impressive games of this generation, delivered with the ability to scale way beyond the limits of PlayStation 4, Xbox One or their enhanced equivalents. In fact, some might say that this translation of the game is almost like a love letter to the PC enthusiast, with a vast array of the game's visual features able to be pushed to the utmost extent. And therein lies the challenge for Rockstar. There are reports of poor optimization, when I just think that the focus of the developers' efforts has moved in a very different direction to the expectations of the users. You see, so many ports of this generation actually have very little scalability at the end of the day. So, for example, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. It's a demanding port for sure, but adjust the settings to high across the board and, well, by and large you have the console visual feature set as it's displayed on Xbox One X. It's a demanding game, but not anything like as scalable as Red Dead 2. So while AC Odyssey can replicate console quality at high settings, the difference with Red Dead 2 is stark. Now, Alex is going to be delivering a detailed breakdown of the game's entire graphical capabilities and illustrating how specific features scale beyond the prior standard bearer for the game, Xbox One X. But suffice to say, if you want your PC simply to deliver console features at a higher performance level, there is no one setting to deliver this. Across the vast gamut of options, Xbox One X has some settings that are equivalent to PC's high, though not many. A few at medium, but several at low or even lower than low, meaning that quality can't be represented on PC. My sense of Rockstar's priorities here is that they're taking the opportunity to use the PC platform to deliver the kind of fidelity that they couldn't achieve on consoles. And this is remarkable, bearing in mind how pristine it looked, especially on Xbox One X. My intention with this video then, it's pretty simple, to get some idea of how scalable Red Dead Redemption 2 is before we move on to what kind of kit you need to get a 60 frames per second experience with as close to console equivalent settings as we can. I say close because an exact lock isn't possible, precisely because some of console's settings are lower than PC's lowest presets. But once you get an idea of the trades and compromises you need to make, well, you don't need a top-end graphics card to get a mostly locked 60 frames per second. I mean, how cheap is a Radeon RX 580 these days? With just the odd blemish, I've managed to get Red Dead 2 running pretty much locked at that required 1080p 60. First up though, some thoughts on scalability. When I first got the game, I ran it on my RTX 2080 Ti. Start high on the hardware side, aim high with settings and see what's what. And rather nicely, Rockstar has supplied a relatively useful benchmark here. It's similar to the one they shipped with Grand Theft Auto 5. We get 4 time-lapse vista shots, then a scripted slice of gameplay. I think it's a fairly decent indication of general gameplay performance, especially as it's set in Saint Denis, one of the most taxing areas of the game. Okay, so to begin with, a quick look at the settings screen. Interestingly, Rockstar doesn't allow for global preset changes as such, high, low, medium, whatever. Instead, there's a slider there that moves between an emphasis on quality and an emphasis on performance. And you'll note that as the slider is adjusted, specific settings are tweaked. Some may be on ultra, some may be on high, some on low. And I think the takeaway message here is that Rockstar is trying to educate the user that getting the best results for what you want from the game means adjusting things on a per setting level. But regardless, for some idea of scalability from a very rough outlook, I went ahead and ignored that and simply adjusted everything from low to ultra, just to give some ballpark idea of how much scalability there is in the game, comparing the very lowest preset to the highest. Frame rate numbers aren't really relevant here. The percentage differentials are. So the RTX 2080 Ti isn't overly stressed bandwidth-wise. I chose 1800p as the target resolution for this test and retained ultra settings and 16 times anisotropic filtering with high TAA throughout. If we assume that ultra sets the baseline at 100%, dropping everything to high increases performance by 21% across the whole benchmark. Ultra to medium 36%. And finally, Ultra versus Low offers up a 53% boost to performance, so it's not a vastly scalable game perhaps, but my guess based on later testing is that the differentials may open up more significantly on lower end cards. Resolution next. At 4K on high settings, 2080 Ti averages 54 frames per second across the whole bench, while dropping to 1440p gives us a 56% increase to performance. Dropping down again to 1080p, well, that's almost a doubling of performance against 4K with a 93% uplift. The 1080p delivers a 24% increase to frame rates over 1440p. So there's fairly decent scalability across settings and resolution. And yeah, Red Dead Redemption 2 has its own internal scaler under the advanced graphics option. I'd have liked to have seen a proper internal resolution number there, but the ratios here are pretty straightforward to follow. 2:1 here means that a 1080p resolution effectively renders both axes at twice resolution, meaning 4K internal rendering. Meanwhile, at the other extreme perhaps, the 5:6 option effectively delivers 900p with a 1080p output resolution or 1800p at 4K. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Internal scalers I think are a great option for PC games. It means you get your HUD delivered at native res with 3D rendering lower. And yeah, 1800p on a 4K screen typically looks rather good. Also within the advanced graphics menu option is the choice to use the Vulkan or DX12 low-level APIs. Historically, GTA 5 offered support for a lot of legacy APIs, so it's good to see this cleaned up in the latest iteration of the Rage engine. But which should you use? Vulkan is the default, and I think it is the default for a reason. On 2080 Ti at 4K, I'll be honest, I didn't see much in the way of any kind of difference. But on the more challenged GTX 1060 at 1440p on a medium plus settings arrangement I set up, well, in the initial benchmark scene there's not much to choose between them, but the further we dig into the bench, the more Vulkan seems to offer. There's a 7% performance advantage at the end of the day. So how about AMD? Well, the RX 580 results can be added now. Overall, Vulkan is closer to DX12 here, and across the length of the bench there's only a 4% advantage in Vulkan's favour. Possibly not noticeable then? Well, I did notice occasional stutter in DX12 during gameplay that I simply didn't encounter in Vulkan. And here's an example of that during the Saint-Denis scripted sequence in the benchmark. So DX12 isn't quite as performant as Vulkan with either of the GPU vendors. Vulkan performance is generally stronger on Nvidia, and while the uplift isn't as large on AMD, the less stutter there is, the better in my opinion. But the elephant in the room here is obviously performance, isn't it, when you look at these graphs? We're at 1440p resolution using a mixture of medium settings with ultra textures, 8 times anisotropic filtering and low precision volumetrics. Okay, so going into this we knew that the settings were going to be demanding, and I just basically went in with medium across the board with some enhancements such as tessellation AF and higher TAA. Now more info came in on how the settings should be adjusted as I was benching, but this is just benchmark territory now, and as ever, they shouldn't really be considered as an indication of how the game runs on more than a superficial level, but they should be considered as a way to judge relative performance between GPUs operating using the exact same workloads. And the startling reality is that from my API testing on 1060 and 580, AMD has a vast 28% performance advantage. Now, Red Dead 2 is a mainstream game that's going to sell millions, and hundreds of thousands of those users, if not more, will be using older GPUs. So I expanded out the mainstream comparison here to encompass the GPUs of yesteryear. Nvidia's Maxwell architecture is represented by the legendary GTX 970 here, while I stack that up against AMD's Hawaii equivalent, the R9 390, both MSI overclock cards. Now, one thing to point out here is that the 390 has 8 gigs of RAM, so I could run that version at ultra textures, while the 970 has its controversial 4 gigs, meaning that I had to adjust textures to high here in order to remove VRAM as a potential bottleneck. The surprise here is how well GTX 970 holds up against the 1060. The Pascal offering is only 8% faster than the Maxwell card, but the R9 390 holds up beautifully as well. Despite its age, it's still 19% faster than the 1060, while offering 93% of the 580's performance. I actually find this quite remarkable. So if the 1060 seems off pace, how does everything stack up with other, more mainstream-orientated NVIDIA offerings? GTX 1070 is a massive 39% faster, while the 1060's actual successor, the Turing-powered 1660, is almost as good, 35% the better. 1660 Ti is another big leap forward over 1060 with a 52% boost. Expect something almost as fast with the freshly minted 1660 Super then. Bottom line though, you need a 1660 or a 1070 to push ahead of the RX 580 in this benchmarking scenario. Another example of AMD's dominance here is that the RX 590 at stock speeds, which is only a bit faster than many factory OC 580s, that's actually on level pegging with GTX 1070 across the bench, and although it's margin of error stuff, a tiny lead over the 1660 there. But obviously 1440p means we're not targeting 1080p at 60 frames per second here, and that's kind of the point of this video. And that's where we're moving with our analysis next. To begin with though, here's a reminder of how performance looked on consoles when we looked at Red Dead 2 at the tail end of last year. PlayStation 4 and the Pro in its checkerboard 2160p output mode could both drop frames under 30, usually in towns and cities. Xbox One X boosted resolution to native 4K and held 30 FPS pretty consistently, while PS4 Pro users could get an absolute 30 FPS lock by adjusting their consoles to 1080p output on the front end. Bottom line though, owing to CPU limitations, 30 was your limit, and this is obviously a key area where PC can improve. By the time I got around to doing these tests, Alex had more of a lock on what Xbox One X equivalent settings were in the PC space, and what you're seeing here are the settings I settled upon for this testing. But there are still some we're looking into as I film this, and others have changed since then. But as a ballpark experience though, this is fairly close and it looks really sweet. Low, medium and high then, but do remember that some settings, like volumetrics for example, are actually the equivalent of lower than low on PC. Question is though, can we hit and sustain 60 frames per second? The classic 1060 versus 580 test here first on those settings. From the off, you can see that our quality settings have the 580 sitting nicely at 60 frames per second, whereas the experience on the 1060 isn't as consistent. I can't run through the whole game looking for performance hotspots, but we have played the console version and we know of some areas that cause issues to those machines' 30 FPS cap. This brawl outside of the saloon packs in NPCs, taxing weather conditions, and you can actually see dropped frames on the 580 here. But relative performance on the 1060, clearly it isn't quite up to snuff. But remember our benchmarks showed that the Turing-powered GTX 1660 is considerably more powerful, 35% faster than the 1060 in like-for-like testing across all 5 benchmark scenarios. Same settings then, 1060 versus 1660, and Turing saves the day really, providing some excellent performance. For the most part, there's a fair amount of overhead, so you may wish to experiment on pushing some settings higher. But it's interesting to note that the brawl outside the saloon can still cause issues, just as it does for the 580. So logically then, let's move on. 1660 versus 580. Same settings, same performance for the most part, and a lot of that may well be down to the fact that we've got VSync 60 FPS as our limit here. But that outside brawl, the action is dynamic and not entirely matched up, but where it is, well, both cards are dropping frames, but I'd say it's a draw overall, wouldn't you? Saint-Denis is seen as the ultimate test, and it certainly caused issues for the consoles. And going back to 1060 versus 580, you can see that AMD is essentially locked to the target frame rate, with the GTX 1060 usually 10 frames per second behind, but that can extend up to 14 frames per second. Remember that we do have that overhead on the AMD side as we are limiting frame rate to 60 frames per second. With 1660 versus 580, Saint-Denis seems to run a little bit better on the 580, which is interesting. The clip here though, very much an outlier, as the vast majority of the run through the city is entirely locked at 60 FPS on both cards. And I'd say that overall, getting this level of visual fidelity from what are relatively cheap GPUs and getting 60 frames per second on a PC port that many people are having issues with, well, I'd say that's pretty good going actually. It is all about careful settings management and not viewing high and ultra as the kind of terrain that's suitable for mainstream GPUs. This is a game that's built to scale into the future. While I was in Saint-Denis, I thought I'd take a look at some water rendering performance. Well, pushing water physics up can cause issues, but this is at the standard out-of-the-box 50%. And while 1060 drops some frames, I'd say it's doing pretty well overall, while the RX 580 is again locked. 1660 versus 580, apart from another minor blip on the Nvidia side, everything holds up pretty well. Quick word on CPU usage here. Well, there's no problems for me as I'm running an overclocked i7 8700K, but CPU utilization is fairly consistent across threads and it looks good. Now, going to the other extreme perhaps, I did push my luck with a 4-core, 4-thread Ryzen 2200G paired with GTX 1660. And well, it wasn't good enough as you can see here, plenty of stutter. But this is hardly a CPU people would go to for hardcore gaming. I think by and large, you stand a pretty good chance of getting 60 frames per second locked with a fast i3 or Ryzen 5 or equivalent Core i5 hardware. A final aside here, if we're kind of ballpark with console settings here, and I've got to stress work is ongoing on that, well, can an RX 580, a 6 teraflop GPU, run at 4K 30 like Xbox One X, another AMD 6 teraflop GPU? On that count, I've got to say that this is a negative. I'm using the game's half-rate VSync here to top out frame rate at 30 frames per second, and this little run around Saint-Denis highlights the kind of performance you're getting. Remember that the 580 will have much less GPU bandwidth than the Xbox One X. I don't know though, it's not bad overall though. 1800p might work, 1620p almost definitely, and I still think it would look great. So let's wrap this up then. Red Dead 2 did have a rocky launch, and yes, I had the same crash to desktop issues that many of you probably had as well. This mostly seemed to happen to me when I was running ultra textures on cards with 6 GB of VRAM or less, but by the time I got around to doing the gameplay frame rate tests, a big patch had dropped and I didn't see this issue again, so maybe things are improving or have improved. Bottom line though, Rockstar has given us a game designed to push its component systems perhaps to their ultimate degrees, to the point where actually spotting the difference may leave some users puzzled. Low, medium and a touch of high with ultra textures, that's the sweet spot for mainstream gaming GPU hardware. But that's not to say that higher presets don't increase fidelity, that they aren't worthwhile, that there isn't a ton for graphics fans to appreciate. I'd say that there is, and that's really where Alex's video will fill you in. I'm just here to say that this PC version of Red Dead 2 is controversial and possibly misunderstood. Yes, there are issues, and I do think there's an argument for ballpark console settings to be set as a default of sorts on this and other games, simply for expectation management, if anything. But that's all a discussion for another day, I reckon. That's where I'm leaving things for now. Do like and subscribe to support the work we do here at Digital Foundry. And of course, we have a bell. The bell is there to be rung, and doing so offers up the delights of instant notifications whenever we post a new Digital Foundry video. To support work like this, and to support the Digital Foundry team more directly, and to allow us to spend days eyeballing and performance testing 40 graphical presets, well, we have the DF Patreon, where a small donation per month allows you to download pristine quality versions of all of our content and supports us in doing the things that we like to do. But that's where I'm leaving everything for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, if indeed you did, and of course just generally, thanks for watching and thanks for supporting Digital Foundry.